Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the University of Birmingham. You join us here in my office up in the Arts Building, and I'm joined by Matthew Powell, and we're going to have a talk about what we've been getting from the various posts over the week and what feedback we've been receiving on the MOOC so far. How's it been going generally, Matthew?
It's been a very enjoyable week, Peter. One of the most interesting discussions have come from the Dream in Literature discussion board. I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on why we put that in and on some of the reasons and some of the things that you drew out of the discussions.
One of the prime reasons for putting it into the design of the MOOC was that we see aviation as a fledgling industry, as a fledgling science, as new science, all very exciting to the very small band of engineers, scientists and practitioners who are likely to be involved in it. But what amazes me out of the whole story is just how excited the whole population gets over aviation and the potential of air power. And it comes out from the various posts we've had, way back into the Greek literature, into Indian literature, and into the old legends that people have always had this fascination with the magic of flight. And we thought it was worth exploring that just a little bit wider so that we could see, when people came to start developing aviation, where they were getting their ideas from, where the excitement came from, and that sort of thing. Is that broadly what we've been seeing?
Certainly it is something that we have been seeing. As you say, it's expanded a lot more from the literature that we've put up and has gone back to, as you say, the Greeks, to Indians, and just the general fascination that humanity's always had with trying to conquer the skies.
Yeah, and tinged with this fascination is the fear of what it's going to bring. So we get the visiting of violence from the air. And we see this in Wells, of course, we see it in Jules Verne, we see it in Gulliver's Travels, and we see it fairly widely. And it's even got biblical connotations about it. One of the other panels that we've been looking at has been the different histories, how historians come at things from different angles. And we've been seeing a lot of stuff, particularly on Hague. How has that side of it been going?
Well, that has actually been the busiest board that we've had, and it's thrown up a lot of interesting discussions. It's certainly an area that I'm interested in and that I would like to do some further research on. But some of the areas that we've looked at has been the reputation of Hague, when his reputation started to be attacked, and the role of the war poets in how the First World War is viewed by the nation as a whole.
There's some really interesting points out of all of this. Let's take some of them in order. When do you think Hague started being vilified?
For me, I think it starts with the publication of Lloyd George's war memoirs, when he looks to vindicate the decisions that he made when he denied troops to Hague in 1918.
I think that's right, and I think that's where it hits the wider population. I think in terms of political manipulation, I think it actually comes in 1917, 1918. And I think we see the origins of it there, which of course as historians, we can actually go back and see what was being written at the time. For the wider public, of course, they're dependent on what they're fed, either through the media. For those that wish to look through Hansard, how much of it's in Hansard, open question. But certainly the publication of those memoirs is seminal in that work. What do you think of the role of the war poets? How significant are they in this?
I think that they certainly do add some colour to how we see people's experiences of the First World War, but I think we have to be very careful with how we use them, in that they're not necessarily representative of the majority of the people who served in the First World War. They are middle class, they have a romanticised view of what war is, and this does not necessarily conform to what they see when they reach the battlefields in the First World War. And so I think we have to be very careful. They're useful, but we have to use them with wider pieces of evidence to get a more rounded view of the First World War.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in the war poetry, we see the war as the poets saw it, not as the vast majority of line soldiers saw it. The late Richard Holmes used to use the case of Tommy Atkins as the average soldier, and I think he had a very different war to those of the war poets, and I do commend Richard's books to you. I think it's also worth having a look at Brian Bond's book Survivors of a Kind, in which he deals in sequence with various of the war poets and puts into context where they were coming from and where their poetry was coming from, or their other works of literature. And so I think we have to be very careful looking through the lens of war poetry, through the lens of Blackadder for that matter. You're a different generation to me. How do you see Blackadder?
Well, I grew up with Blackadder. I have to say I enjoy all the series, but we have to view it as entertainment and not as seeing the war as it was. It amazes me that people see Richard Curtis and Ben Elton as being eminent military historians, which quite clearly not. They're very good comedy writers, but historians they are not.
Very insightful comedy writers, very astute in terms of what makes a good programme. I've enjoyed them over the years, and I'm word perfect in some of them, Lord Flashheart in particular. But again, we have to be very, very careful. And it always used to worry me when my children came home from school having been fed a diet of neat Blackadder in terms of this is historical depiction. And I think it's one of the pleasures of doing a MOOC like this, is that we can actually take these things and start exploring them in more detail. What are the other themes that have come out of the different histories?
We've had some ideas about, and again, I think this is something that's very important when we analyse war, is how we analyse war at the operational and strategic levels. A lot of discussions have been taking place highlighting offensives such as the Somme and Third Ypres, saying that very little ground was gained for all the men lost. And I think that that is a flawed way to view the First World War and the offensives of the British, because it doesn't take into account the operational and strategic level gains that may be made and may not show themselves for several months or possibly even years after the event.
I think that's right. I think one of the things that we have to look at is, instead of looking at the trench by trench by trench by trench, start looking at the nation versus nation, blocks of nation versus blocks of nations, and their war economies. When you start looking at the damage done to the German war economy by the naval blockade, and that killed far more civilians, had a far greater impact on the war than just the Somme or just Third Ypres, and yet it's something that is very rarely covered. And yet there are so many important lessons come from that into the Second World War, where grinding down the German war machine is as an important part as beating them on the fronts. And of course in the Second World War it's beating the Germans on the Eastern Front as much, if not considerably more, than the Western Front.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly. I also think that it's important that we view the strategic nature of the First World War and we realise why it is that the British and the French are having to attack all the time. And this comes down to the fact that the Germans, when the race to the sea ends in stalemate, retreat to the best defensive positions, dig themselves in and essentially see this as the new German border, and it's up to the French and the British to remove them from occupied land. This is why we see so many attacks, so many offensives, and when this is combined with the tactical superiority of the defence, it means any offensive conducted is likely to lead to heavy casualties.
And it has to be acknowledged as well, of course, that the Germans lose huge numbers, as well as the British, as well as the French. But you're quite right, I think, in that these offensives have to take place. You can't allow a status quo to develop to the point where, well, we've got a new border, let's just live with it. That was totally unacceptable. When you look at the reasons why the nations went to war, you certainly can't just stop. That has to be borne in mind. Overall impressions for the week?
Very good. A very good mix of people in terms of gender, in terms of nationalities. Some people with a very big interest in aviation, some coming to it for the first time, some just looking to expand on their knowledge of the First World War in general, and I think this is a great opportunity for them to do so.
Highlights for next week? What are we looking forward to?
Highlights for next week, we will be looking at the role that the aircraft and air power plays in the First World War and how this develops over time, how doctrine, how tactics develop, And also something that's of interest to me in my current research is how the aviation industry in Britain starts from a very low base but builds itself up very, very quickly.
A huge amount of elasticity in that. I think one of the bits that I'm looking forward to next week is when we get into the discussion on chivalry and how the myth of chivalry was built up and how that tries to distance airborne warfare from land warfare. And I think that's an exciting prospect to come. So thank you for your time. We look forward to catching up with you next week and the week after, and enjoy the rest of the MOOC. Thank you.